side, and again diagonal to us. It's a building that looks as if it is stacked one floor on top of another, kind of like Legos. Maybe like an Oreo cream filling between each floor. Obviously not double stuffed, it's pretty thin. And it was built in 1972. It's called the Aon Center here in Chicago. And when the Aon Center was first built, it was actually made with pink marble that had been imported from Italy. And that's what wrapped around each floor. It was beautiful. But the Chicago weather is very fickle, and it can be easily negative 30 degrees in the winter, and this marble couldn't hack it. And it started to crack and crumble, and it fell to the ground. So they had to replace it, because marble falling from the sky is a little bit dangerous. So they replaced it with this North Carolina granite. It cost them over $80 million to do so, which was more than half the price it cost them to build it in the first place. Just goes to show, guys, you can't take your marble for granted. All right, also on your guys' left-hand side is a building shaped as a triangle. And you can call this the Swiss Odal or the Swiss Hotel. It's really up to you. This is built by Harry Weiss, who said, hey, if you guys stay here, you get free views. You get a view of Lake Michigan, a view of the Chicago River, or hey, why not, a view of this big brown boxy building. And this big brown boxy building is very significant here in Chicago. And that's because it is designed by the architect of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was very popular in the 1970s and the 1980s. And that's because he was the beginning of the modern movement. He said, if you are going to build a church, go on, girl, make it beautiful. But if you are going to build a building just for corporations and businesses, 3 words, keep it simple. So you'll see his work and his influence throughout all of Chicago today. All right, we're going to switch our eyeball directions again, so it's going to look like you're rolling your eyes at me. I'll forgive you just this once. And it's going to be to your right-hand side and in front of you. The sun's kind of blocking it out, but it's a cream building with a clock at the very top of it. And this is called Wrigley Center. It sits at the base of the Magnificent Mile, or Michigan Avenue. I say Mich Ave. It's not a computer, Mich Ave, which is known for restaurants and shopping. Well, Wrigley Center was built throughout the Great Depression. It began in 1929 and it finished in 1931. And you know those people who constantly have to be chewing on something? You have your Orbit gum, you have your Trident gum, snap, you have your Wrigley's Junior chewing gum. Well, this was the owner, this was the man, and he had made so much money off of Wrigley's Junior chewing gum, he was able to build this building throughout the Great Depression. And though it is a really cool building, he tricks you guys, because the Cornerstone fuses at the very bottom of it is a darker shade than at the very top, almost unnoticeably, so that it is to draw the observer's eyes towards the bottom, working its way up, making it appear a little bit bigger and a little bit more magnificent than it really is. What a jokester. Okay, on your right-hand side, kind of in front of you, is the second tallest building here in Chicago. This is Trump Tower, which is owned by Donald Trump, who you may have heard of. And if you have, I'm sure you guys have heard of these 3 things. 1, you're fired. 2, bad news over and 3, Trump, money, and power. So it's really no surprise that Trump Tower is the most expensive building to have ever been built here in Chicago. But when he came to Chicago, he had plans to build the tallest building here in America and in the world. But his plans came a year too late, because it was a year after 9/11 had happened in New York City. So our mayor then said, no sir, nope, we're not claiming the tallest building in the world in America here in Chicago, sorry. So Donald Trump must be a little bit bitter about this even today, because there's a restaurant on the 6th floor of Trump Tower called 16, again with the creativity. And if a group of 4 of you were to go there to dinner tonight, he would charge you guys about $600. So who's taking me to dinner tonight? Oh, please don't all jump at once. Well, right beside Trump Tower is a big brown boxy building meaning one thing. A Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. His last building to have been built here in Chicago. It was built in 1984 and it was the old IBM building. I don't point it out because it is aesthetically beautiful, but because not everybody agreed with him. In fact, an architect by the name of Bernard Goldberg came up with these 2 towers called the Marina Towers, just to go against Ludwig. Because he said, listen up, Ludwig, you're a wet blanket, man. You're boring. You're dampening the human spirit. And Bernard loved nature. Everything he did, he drew from nature. So he designed these 2 towers, and they are supposed to be giant flowers, which is pretty ask anybody here in Chicago where the Marina Towers are, some may not know what you're talking about. Many do refer to these as giant corn cobs. But that's not too much of an epic miss, considering hey, that's still a part of nature. Well, Marina Towers sit in an area called Marina City. And it is supposed to be able to be a city unto itself. You are supposed to be able to live there without ever really having to leave that area. Because you have condominiums, restaurants, parking garages. You have the House of Blues, bowling alleys, and movie theaters. All right, who was alive in 1914? I thought so. You look familiar. All right, well, this building on your right-hand side, that is red brick, is the oldest building on our tour today, and the first building to have ever been built along the river here in Chicago, and that is in 1914, making it the Reed Murdoch Building. And because it is so old, it has served Chicago many great purposes. It has been the first ever court for traffic violators. You know, all of you who drive and say, hey, no cop, no stop, but then they catch you and they send a ticket in the mail. That's where you go. It was also a restaurant, and one time while it was a restaurant, it was a city more delicious, right? Well, that's because right here in this part of the riverbank was the Great Eastland Boat Disaster. And some say this boat accident was even more tragic than the Titanic, and I totally agree. In 1915, a company decided to reward its employees for working so hard by taking them on a boat over to Indiana for the weekend. Well, they all got on the boat super excited, and they stayed on one side of the boat super excited. But the weight was very undistributed, and it tipped, and when it tipped, it killed over 863 people. Very tragic. Chicago panicked, and they literally pulled the buildings out of the river and stored them in the Reed Murdoch Building while it was a restaurant that time. All right, well, I'm done being a Debbie Downer. So also on your right-hand side is the Chicago Merchandise Mart. And the Chicago Merchandise Mart was also built in the Great Depression. And that's epic, that's huge, because many people who invested in properties and buildings definitely went bankrupt during the Great Depression. But not this guy. This guy had his head on his shoulders, and his name was Marshall Field. You may have heard of him. You have Marshall Field's department stores, Marshalls, and Macy's. He was the guy behind all of it, but he wanted something else. He wanted a little bit more. He wanted to own the widest merchandise mart in the world, which he has succeeded in doing so. Because if you turn around to your right-hand side, you'll see how wide the Chicago Merchandise Mart really is. In fact, it is so wide it has its very own zip code, 60650. So you guys plan on mailing them stuff. Well, just a year after the Great Depression ended, he had to file for bankruptcy. And he sold it. And he sold to a little-known family called the Kennedys. And the Kennedys have owned this building up until 3 years ago when they too sold it. But the Kennedys have made a pretty penny off the Chicago Merchandise Mart. In fact, if you were to take their income as a whole, from the first Kennedy to have ever been born to the one living today, 1/4 of it has came from the Chicago Merchandise Mart. Do you guys know how much that is? It is close to $100 million, my friends. What am I talking about? That's pocket change, right? On really hot days, like today, my friends love being around me because I keep hundies or hundreds in my pocket, and I tend to whip them out and make it rain to cool everyone else off with them. It's really cool. Okay, also on your guys' right-hand side, do you guys see the theme right? Because if we're always on the right, we can never be wrong. And you'll see a sparkly silver chrome building. And this is called the Bowen Building here in Chicago. But before it was the Bowen Building in Center, it was actually home to Morton Salt International Headquarters. And I'm sure you guys have heard of Morton Salt. It's definitely a household product. You know, people say blood pressure, what? I'm not scared to put salt on everything. Well, these are your guys. But they decided to peace out in the year 2000. And they said, see you later, Chicago, we're out of here. And they left this building vacant. Chicago was quite devastated by this because that means we lost revenue, we lost jobs, kind of put our economy in a little bit of a downfall. But luckily for us, there was a silver lining in that cloud, and Boeing had been looking for some property here in Chicago. And we really wanted them here, but they played Chicago. They definitely played us because they said, no thanks, Chicago. We're not going to take your weather. And by that I mean your offer, because we don't like your guys' weather. Chicago was really devastated by this, especially because they were from Seattle. And Seattle is not known for their weather.